Okay, altitude sickness, high altitude sickness, and how we adapt to high altitude. First of all, we need to understand the problem. So the problem obviously is that there is far less oxygen in the high altitudes. Why there is far less oxygen? Because the pressure is far smaller. The pressure, so the amount of all of the air, including oxygen, and the partial pressure of the oxygen is partial pressure of the oxygen, as you know, is critical for the binding the oxygen to the hemoglobin, as is represented by the oxygen dissociation curve. So the oxygen dissociation curve shows us that we need some partial pressure of the oxygen to get enough of the oxygen into the blood. At high altitudes, the amounts of oxygen are far smaller, so obviously we need to adapt somehow. Okay, I would help myself with the video What is Altitude Sickness by Medic Ini. Please like the video and subscribe if you can. So let's go for now. I will stop and fill some gaps also later. Okay, so let's start.
Decided you wanted to go traveling and you thought, hey, I should totally go mountain climbing. So you're up there and suddenly you don't feel too good. You feel dizzy, nauseous, and you have a killer headache. Well, you might have altitude sickness. So what is altitude sickness? Well, firstly, it will be useful to understand how the atmosphere changes at higher altitudes. The higher you go away from the Earth's surface, the less dense the air is. This means there's a lower concentration of oxygen for your body to use. Altitude sickness is effectively your body struggling to function with less oxygen than normal. Your body will panic in this state and try to help you by increasing your breathing and your heart rate. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, we can
obviously, increasing breathing and increasing heart rate is, as you know, is a response for hypoxemia generally. So our organism tries to get more of the oxygen into the tissues. So in order to get more of the oxygen into the tissues, it needs to get more oxygen into the lungs, so more breathing, and then more oxygen, more blood to the tissues, simply.
So what altitude sickness actually is. Altitude sickness normally occurs at altitudes of 2,500 meters and above, and it has three main forms. The mildest form is known as acute mountain sickness, or AMS. The next two forms are known as high altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, and high altitude cerebral edema, HACE. The main symptoms of acute mountain sickness are very similar to textbook symptoms of other illnesses. They're nausea, headache, and dizziness, and generally it's quite similar to having the flu. However, AMS is a massive red flag and your body telling you to do something quickly, as things can very easily progress to high altitude pulmonary edema. This is a potentially life-threatening condition where fluid builds up in the lungs. When your body is starved of oxygen, the blood vessels around your lungs constrict to increase the pressure.
Okay, about this we'll talk also one more time later, but generally this is a very important effect. So when there is not enough of the air in some part of the lungs, the blood vessels constricts in this area. This is in most of the cases very good, because we have limited amount of the blood that is flowing through the lungs, and this limited amount of the blood should flow only through these areas that are enough of the oxygen there. Yes. So, for example, if we have some fluid in some of the alveoli, or some of the alveoli are just glued together and there is no air there, the blood should omit those sites and get in the other places. But in case of the high altitudes, there are everywhere not enough of the oxygen. Yes, there is everywhere problem with oxygen. So if you are getting too fast, too high, the blood vessels everywhere would constrict. It would lead to far higher blood pressure in the lungs, and if you have higher blood pressure, the fluid would flow outside the blood vessels, and it would lead to edema of the lungs. So we will generally, if we would have it, would be in risk of drowning in our own fluids. I will talk one more time about this later in the course, but this is good primer to understand it.
This, however, is what causes the fluid to fill the lungs. A lung that is full of fluid cannot absorb oxygen, creating a vicious cycle. High altitude cerebral edema is a buildup of fluid in the brain, and again, this is an emergency. The brain fits very snugly in the skull and doesn't exactly have much wiggle room, so any swelling can very easily lead to damage to the brain tissues. To prevent altitude sickness, the best thing you can do is to properly acclimatize to the height. This means going up slowly, and as a general rule of thumb, not going up more than 300 to 500 meters a day. But to avoid altitude sickness completely, maybe go traveling somewhere with less mountains and climbing. Thank you for watching today's video.
Okay, thank you very much. I suppose for today it's enough. So, goodbye.